November 5th saw millions of Americans glued to their screens into the early hours of the morning, and I was certainly no exception. I had good reason to believe I knew how it would end. I followed polls and trends, listened to those more knowledgeable than myself, and had a well-informed estimate for each individual state. But the night dragged on and marched towards the impossible. I knew Trump could win, but it would be tight, less than a point in crucial states, and he could never dream of winning the popular vote. And yet, here we are. I think I'm far from alone in my surprise, so I'd like to explore the two fundamental questions this election raised. How did Trump do so well? And why was I so blindsided by this outcome? There were a million small mistakes that led to my poor prediction. I overestimated the impact abortion would have on the election. I put too much stock in the idea that down ballot races with unpopular Republican candidates and controversial referendums would sway the top of the tickets. I assumed that pollsters had learned from underselling Trump's odds at winning in 2016 and 2020, while believing that Democrats would continue to outperform polls as they had since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Ultimately, though, all of these faulty assumptions came from the same underlying belief. I believed that 2016 was a fluke. It was my understanding that we lived in a majority progressive country. Each generation was more progressive than the last, and non white communities were and would continue to be bastions of the left. Even if elections were close right now, every cycle more baby boomers died and more of Generation Z reached voting age. This rising tide seemed unstoppable and inescapable. It was therefore only natural that in the face of this reality, there would be one last push of reactionary defiance. And there was, in the form of Donald Trump. He eked out a victory in 2016, winning by less than 1 percentage point in key states, despite losing the popular vote by 3 million. But despite these final defiant flailings, the tide rose. He lost his bid for re-election in 2020, falling short in nearly every swing state, some by healthy margins, and being outpaced in the popular vote by just over 7 million. Now it was 2024, and another 4 years had passed. Who could even guess how high the tide had risen? But it hadn't, and it likely won't. In fact, it seems to me that 2020 was the desperate outlier in an otherwise consistent trend of increasing reactionary thought and support in this country, going back well over a decade. The simplest way of understanding his victory is less of a victory for the Republicans and more of a devastating loss for the Democrats. In 2020, Donald Trump received 74 million votes to Joe Biden's 81 million. In this election, Trump got 73 million votes, while Kamala could only scrape together 69 million. It's a decrease of 12 million. The Democrat Party lost 15% of their voter base in only 4 years. This is not something that could be overcome by better campaigning. It's not something that could be explained by an unlikable candidate. This is what it looks like when a party, as it exists, has become unviable. Why then have the Democrats plummeted out of viability all of a sudden? Well, it isn't sudden at all. In order to really understand that, we need to go back to 2008, when Barack Obama carried 53% of the popular vote and 365 electors. Looking at this map, it's important to take in the scale of this victory. Not only did he win so many states, the margins of victory are hard to overstate. If every state he won voted 5 points to the right, he still would have won the Electoral College. He was a popular and well-liked president, with an approval rating over 50% coming up to his bid for re-election in 2012. And he did win, but this time with only 51% of the vote and 332 electors. Before this point in modern American history, incumbent presidents had a bias in their favor. They were expected to gain ground and for it to be an easier win. A 2% drop may seem small, but in this context, it's hiding a much larger slip that serves as the turning point for Democrats in this country. Then came 2016 and disaster struck. Hillary Clinton ran against Donald Trump and only managed 48% of the vote and 227 electors. Trump, while only receiving 46% of the popular vote, outperformed polls by roughly 3% nationwide and claimed a narrow victory in the Electoral College. Liberals across the country were shocked, horrified, and aggrieved. They immediately began looking for answers. They looked to Russian interference, sexism in the voter base, the fact that Hillary Clinton was the least likable bitch east of the Mississippi. While it may be the case that some combination of these or any other reasons may have contributed to her loss, the best explanation of how she was in a position to lose at all is simply that the trend of dwindling Democrat support was marching on. Trump did not mastermind this trend. He didn't even start it. But say what you will about him, he is an excellent opportunist, and this was an opportunity he saw. The Republican Party was long polarizing and populizing, so as we began to transition to a new era of populism, those trends were always going to carry it ahead of the neoliberal and institutionalist Dems. But it was leaderless and directionless. As a large mass of Americans grew radical and aggrieved, they were looking for a strong man to point that anger somewhere. In a worse world, they would have found a competent and ambitious fascist. Instead, they got a dopey New York businessman. Regardless, he was now inexorably tied to the movement. And more than the dangerous rhetoric, terrible policies, or anti institutionalist appeal, it was that dopey, incompetent, and narcissistic appeal that made liberals mad, furious, foaming at the mouth. So frustrated and insulted were they that their beloved civility, respected traditions, and ever present professionalism was under threat by an underbaked fuckweasel that when the 2020 election came around, they voted in droves. Biden ousted Trump with 51% of the popular vote and 303 electors. The American left saw this and breathed a collective sigh of relief. It was a fluke after all. Trump had been defeated, and now the Republican Party was faced with returning to normalcy or dying a slow death. But of course, it wasn't a fluke. Trump wasn't defeated, and now, here we are. For the first time in 20 years, a Republican won the popular vote. Last Tuesday, Donald Trump became the 47th president elect, with 51% of the vote and 312 electors. While progressives like me all around the world stared at the screen in horror, faulty predictions in hand. How did Trump win? Because we didn't vote, because the Democrats wouldn't adapt, and because we refused to recognize that this would always be the outcome. What does this mean, and what do we do, are questions for other videos, but I'll leave you with this. Now, we know. We've been ripped of every excuse and given every opportunity to spend these next 3 years fighting to make sure every man, woman, and child who cares about this country knows. People don't want a return to normalcy. They don't want a breath of fresh air, and they sure as hell don't want Kamala Harris. They want radical change. They want to be seen and heard by a party willing to make bold stances, quicker to reach out a helping hand than to reach across the aisle. The Democrats of our parents are non viable, gone, dead. We need Bernie Sanders. What do you mean he's retiring? Fuck! Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Great line, but it's dead wrong. History moves fast and points where it's hammered. If we don't keep up, it will leave us behind. If we don't shape it, it will encircle us. We're on the back foot now. That sucks. Get up, get moving, and hammer hard. I'll see you next time.